This amendment redrafts the intent section of the underlying proposal. Mr. Speaker, the U.S. Constitution explicitly forbids bills of attainder, and our state constitution likewise requires that law apply as evenly as possible, as fairly as possible, to all people affected by that law. The underlying proposal rubs up against our ban against bills of attainder, our tradition of making sure that our public policy is fair and equitable to all groups. This intent section, the proposed intent section in this amendment, makes it clear that this proposal does things that may be problematic with those good traditions and those prohibitions. Mr. Speaker, let's speak plainly. The underlying policy is directed at federal immigration law enforcement agencies. And by extension, Mr. Speaker, it will affect the ability of the federal government to enforce lawful federal immigration policy. We need to make this known to anyone who might see the bill, might want to understand what this policy is trying to do, and in fact does. In the interest of speaking plainly and clearly to the truth of what this proposal sets out to do, please vote yes on this amendment to set up our legislative intent in a true way, in a clear way, and in a strong way that acknowledges the issues raised by the underlying policy.
The member from the 19th, Representative Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good amendment. Please vote yes. Consideration when you vote yes on this amendment is the increasing accuracy and, frankly, aggressiveness of facial recognition software. Mr. Speaker, it is becoming increasingly a tool, and I would even say a tool of some concern in many contexts, that software technology, and hate to use a cliche, but aided by artificial intelligence, AI, is getting very good at recognizing faces, whether they're obscured or not. For that reason, I think that this amendment does add clarity to the definition by pointing out that it's facial identity that is at stake here, is at play here, either to protect that facial identity or, I guess, to dox that facial identity. So it's a clarifying addition to the definition. Please vote yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good amendment. Please vote yes. Structurally similar to the previous amendment that was accepted about using ATVs and vehicles. In this case, we're addressing the matter of headgear, which may include some obscuring of the face, might be considered a face mask, that is of a religious nature, that is an expression of religious beliefs, devoutly held religious beliefs. While this is not a very common occurrence for law enforcement or for federal immigration law enforcement, it is something that occurs from time to time. And Mr. Speaker, I would dare say that some people wear face coverings of all sorts as a kind of religious or philosophical belief. So to make allowance for those rare but real occasions where an individual law enforcement officer may wear a religious head garb or other that obscures his or her face, we're asking for a yes vote on this amendment to be consistent with the various religious and freedom of conscience protections that are in both the state constitution and the federal constitution. It helps this policy comply. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good amendment. Please vote yes. Mr. Speaker, I want to emphasize elsewhere in the underlying proposal, there is language about a private right of action. That means a lawsuit that any individual who feels aggrieved could bring. And in that situation, where a law enforcement officer was wearing a scarf or something else that was weather-related, and that ended up somehow obscuring the officer's face, while it was not intended to be a mask to obscure the officer's identity, an individual who felt aggrieved and was filing a lawsuit about it could make the argument that the scarf, or maybe it's a hood of a jacket, was effectively a mask. This amendment clarifies the language in the proposal so that we wouldn't get an aggressive civil action, legalistic argument that a scarf or part of a hood of a jacket was effectively a mask. We need to be careful here, Mr. Speaker, in setting this policy in place, and I would recommend a yes vote on the amendment.
Member for the 19th, Representative Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to move Amendment 2135 because what's good for the goose. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good amendment. Please vote yes. Mr. Speaker, there are often lately in situations where particularly federal immigration law enforcement agencies are serving a warrant, or what they usually call a detainer. It's not just the law enforcement officers and the object of the warrant or detainer involved. We've seen situations around the country where activist third parties insert themselves into the situation, frankly, to interfere with the delivery of the warrant or the detainer. This is a very precarious situation, Mr. Speaker, and one of kind of recent development. It didn't used to be that activists felt empowered to interfere with the lawful delivery of a warrant. But this does happen these days. And for that reason, it's not just the two parties involved. This is a good adjustment to the underlying policy to allow the law enforcement officer lawfully delivering a warrant to cover their face. Now, mind you, they're still identified by badge or other device, not so much because of trouble with the object of the warrant, but trouble with a third party who may decide to insinuate themselves into the delivery of the warrant or the detainer. These are unusual times, Mr. Speaker. And this clarification of what the underlying proposal does is meeting these unusual times at the right point. Please vote yes.
The floor remarks. The member for the 19th, Representative Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good amendment. Please vote yes. Over the interim, I attended an event at the Seattle City Hall, which was controversial. And the Seattle Police Department had cordoned off part of City Hall area. It was outside the building where the event was being held. And at the perimeter, there were some very angry, very violent protesters. Their faces were covered. And as I walked into the event, I actually came through the crowd and wanted to see and hear what the angry protesters had to say. There were also some Seattle Police Department officers kind of at the outer edge of the protesting crowd. And I asked them, so are you guys undercover? And they answered, no, we're not undercover. We're just in plain clothes. We're just keeping an eye on things, trying to keep the peace. And I learned then, that day, that police officers hold the distinction between what is strictly speaking undercover activity and plainclothes activity. Now, in that case, Mr. Speaker, I believe it would have been appropriate for the plainclothes officers to have covered their faces. It would have allowed them to blend in more easily with the crowd, or at least not stood out from the crowd. And that would not, strictly speaking, be undercover work, but it would be good work for keeping the peace. And in their world, a key distinction between a particular undercover enforcement action and more regular plainclothes policing. So I think this amendment, which addresses that distinction, is important in that case. I think it will help law enforcement, whether they be federal immigration agents or Seattle Police Department detectives or other plainclothes officers, to be effective in keeping the peace. And I should end up this story, Mr. Speaker, by saying nothing bad happened that day. The protesters were angry, they were covering their faces, they were screaming a lot, but there was no harm done to anyone. So the Seattle Police Department was effective. Let them be effective. Vote yes on this amendment.
For the further remarks, the member for the 19th, Representative Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good amendment. Please vote yes. Mr. Speaker, criminal mischief is a charge, and really a kind of a basket of charges, because it involves various specific activities, is very relevant to the issue at hand, both in the underlying proposal and, of course, to this amendment. It's relevant in this way, Mr. Speaker. Let me divert a little bit. At the recent State of the Union speech back in D.C., a member of Congress wore a button, prominent and available for all to see, that said F ICE, except it didn't say F, it said the word. And that kind of rhetoric around law enforcement, whether...
Please direct your remarks to this amendment, not to the underlying bill. Proceed.
Thank you. That kind of rhetoric frames criminal mischief, malicious mischief, exactly. That kind of rhetoric around law enforcement issues encourages exactly the kind of mischief described in this amendment. And mischief, of course, can be violent, but it also includes, defacing public monuments, public buildings, and that basket of activities, whether it's using a can of spray paint to spray something obscene on the side of a building, or to attack an individual, or to insinuate yourself, literally insert yourself into the delivery of a warrant or a detainer, that kind of criminal mischief is a greater risk in our law enforcement officers' daily life than it's ever been. And so the amendment, by specifically describing criminal mischief, acknowledges that in the current time, in these days, that kind of activity is more likely than it's ever been. And in that context, it would be reasonable for an officer to obscure his or her face to protect themselves from the mischievous criminal. It's very timely and very relevant. Please vote yes on the amendment. Good amendment, Mr. Speaker. Please vote yes. Mr. Speaker, this amendment speaks more precisely to, rather than just civil unrest, to riots and other kinds of specific violence. Mr. Speaker, as I've mentioned already, the current political context around law enforcement, particularly the delivery of lawful warrants and detainers, is different than it used to be. There are political activists who feel emboldened to insert themselves into the process of delivering the warrant or the detainer, or other actions of law enforcement officers lawfully executing the duties of their office. It's not like it used to be. And again, sometimes these riots and these uprisings are vandalism to the vehicle or to a building, but sometimes they are actually physical, I wouldn't call it assault, but insertion stepping into the process, stepping between the law enforcement officer and the individual suspect or the object of a warrant or detainer. Mr. Speaker, this emboldened activity on the part of politically radical rioters is a real threat to law enforcement. And we've seen it in the media, in the news, all around. This is an important clarification, yes, of the language that's already in the underlying proposal, but we have to recognize what's happening, Mr. Speaker. This is a new approach that political activists of an anarchistic bent are using. This amendment recognizes that new reality. Please vote yes. All right, we're going to try to do with this amendment what we have tried to do with some of the other amendments. It's a little more broadly described, but what we're saying in this amendment is that if a law enforcement officer can show in good faith, based on his or her professional training, that there is specific need in a situation to cover his or her face, they would be allowed to do it. And it would require a process, but basically the showing of a good faith belief that a situation, whether it was a riot, whether it was a violent protest, whether it was a one-off criminal mischief situation, any of those, if the officer could establish a good faith, reasonable expectation that the situation warranted covering his or her face, they could do that. It expands on several of the allowances in the underlying bill that are already there, but I think it gives the law enforcement officer and the agencies, whether they're the federal Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency or whether they're a local police department, the flexibility to use their professional training and their good judgment made in good faith, which they would have to show if there were any dispute after the fact. They would be allowed then to cover their face in that potentially violent or violent situation. Mr. Speaker, this amendment is important because we have to give law enforcement the ability to protect themselves in order to be effective in their jobs. And I think this strikes a good balance, this amendment strikes a good balance of not being as narrowly tailored as we've heard some of these amendments and objections to the amendments because they were so narrowly tailored. A little more flexible, but to the same point. Let the law enforcement officers use their training and their judgment, and if the situation warrants, cover their faces. Please vote yes.
The member for the 19th, Representative Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a good amendment. Please vote yes. Mr. Speaker, what we are trying to do here, and this amendment does it, is find that place where we can recognize the urgency of these bad situations and allow law enforcement to do its job effectively with the proper amount of discretion in the particular tactical moves they'll use, including perhaps covering their face. Mr. Speaker, we've heard various disagreements that some of this is too narrow, some of this is too broad. Well, I mean, the language in this amendment is well crafted in the language of law enforcement for those situations in which urgent action is required and appropriate. The risk that we run in the policy in the underlying bill is that it will create disincentives and inefficiencies in law enforcement. And this amendment does a good job of reducing that risk. What we all want in the end is for law enforcement to be able to act lawfully and effectively. Please vote yes on the amendment. Mr. Speaker, the troubling element, well, I don't know, there are several troubling elements of the underlying bill, but certainly one of the troubling elements is the private right of action. And this practically invites an unintended consequence of civil litigation to anyone who believes they would be aggrieved by the officer in a situation covering his or her face. Mr. Speaker, I am concerned about the politicization of law enforcement lawfully executing their duties. The example that the woman from the 36 raised from another state were situations where individuals interfered with law enforcement lawfully implementing the duties of their jobs. And as I've mentioned before, in context of other amendments, there is an emboldened nature among politically radical activists that they can physically insert themselves into the law enforcement officers doing their duty. And in the underlying proposal, there's a private right of action that can follow from this. So what the amendment here does is it says that an aggrieved party, and to your earlier colloquy, it could be a second party, it could be a third party, some other person who feels they are aggrieved. That means they were confronted by or involved with a law enforcement officer whose face was covered, could initiate a civil action, a lawsuit against the officer, against the department, Lord knows, I mean, against the city, against the state, against the federal government. The amendment is rational. It says that if the aggrieved party was also masked, that they could not initiate that lawsuit against whoever. It's a reasonable clarification and improvement in the underlying policy. Please vote yes on this amendment.
The member from the 19th District, Representative Walsh.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Bad bill, vote no. Madam Speaker, there's an old saying in public policy that the worst proposals aim at Group A and end up hitting Group B. That's exactly what we have in this flawed proposal. We've heard it on the floor, and we know it from the context of this proposal from its start, that this is aimed at the Federal Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE. But it drags along local law enforcement. And Madam Speaker, as it must, because in order to get the premise that allows it to do something unconstitutional, which is try to dictate tactical tools used by a federal law enforcement agency, it has to sweep local law enforcement agencies into its four corners. That's unfortunate, Madam Speaker, because as you've heard, the federal Constitution has a supremacy clause, but as I know you know, the state Constitution has a correlated supremacy clause, Article 1, Section 2. So there is almost no scenario in which this proposal will practically be able to limit what ICE does. It's a federal agency. So who is going to have to live with the elements of this bill? Our state law enforcement agencies and our local law enforcement agencies. Madam Speaker, we can say that this proposal is about accountability, but it is so flawed in its form that it's not going to do the thing we all know it's meant to do. which is to try to restrict and I suppose hold accountable somehow federal law enforcement agents. And Madam Speaker, we've heard talk of believing in people who can't find their family members. Well, Madam Speaker, that applies to a lot of contexts here in our state. There are other elements of law that hide family members from family members. This bill is imprecise, it is structurally flawed, it creates a private right of action that will be a plaintiff attorney's buffet, and it doesn't make anyone safer.